He wound the antique watch to hear forgotten sins. The final wind showed him his own future. We talk about free will as though it were a quantity we simply have, a fixed endowment, present from birth, as available at the end of a life as at its beginning. The older traditions were less certain about this. They spoke of free will as a resource, something that could be drawn down, something that could, if the conditions were exactly wrong and the mechanism exactly right, be depleted entirely, leaving behind a body that continued to move, to act, to speak, but which was no longer the source of any of these things. What is left when free will is gone is not emptiness. The traditions are careful about this. What is left is an automaton, a body in perfect working order, performing every external function of a person, with no one left inside to choose any of it. Edmund Drax had been a watchmaker for 40 years when the pocket watch came to him for restoration. He was precise, patient, and not given to the mystical. He had worked on every variety of timepiece made in 3 centuries and had never found one that did what this one did. He wound it 19 times. By the 19th wind, there was no one left to decide to stop. The watch arrived on a Tuesday in a padded envelope with no return address, a common enough occurrence in Edmund Drax's trade, where clients sometimes preferred anonymity and always preferred not to transport delicate antiques in person when they could be couriered. The envelope contained the watch, a note that read, "Restoration only, no valuation required," and a folded card with a phone number that, when Edmund tried it 3 days later to confirm receipt, rang to an automated message in a language he didn't recognize. He set the card aside and examined the watch. It was extraordinary. An English pocket watch, white enamel dial, gilt case circa 1720 by the movement's construction, a period he knew well. The golden era of English horology, the craftsmen whose names appeared in the histories. The case was engraved on the outer surface with a pattern he initially read as the decorative scroll work common to the period, and then, with his loupe and better light, resolved into text. Latin, very small, very precisely engraved, running in a continuous spiral from the case's center, hinge outward. A prayer, or what read formally as a prayer, the structure of address, petition, and response, but with a content that he copied into his workbench notebook with the slight frown of someone who reads Latin adequately and finds a particular passage strange. The petition, translated, read approximately, "Let time be held from escaping. Let what is sealed remain sealed. Let the mechanism bind what the mechanism was given to bind." The response, in a different and marginally less formal Latin construction, read, "One wind counterclockwise opens the seal. What was sealed will speak. What speaks will cost." He found this interesting. He did not find it alarming. He had restored timepieces with unusual provenance before. A clock that had belonged to a Victorian mesmerist, a mantel clock from a 19th century asylum, and it developed the equable detachment of a craftsman who works with the material history of objects without needing to share their owner's beliefs about them. The movement, when he opened the case, was in good condition, worn, but carefully maintained over 3 centuries by someone with professional knowledge. The mechanism was standard for its period except for one feature, the crown, which should have wound clockwise, had been modified at some point in its history, subtly with the same quality of craftsmanship as the original, to wind only counterclockwise. A small, precise reversal that Edmund recognized as deliberate and made a note of. He wound it counterclockwise, one full rotation, because he was testing the mechanism. The sensation was immediate and complete. Not a vision, not a dream, not a hypnagogic dissolve. A memory, his own memory, but not one he had access to. A moment from his childhood, age 8, in the backyard of the house he had grown up in. Summer afternoon, the specific sensory detail of a particular moment that he recognized with certainty was real, and which he had, until now, simply not been able to recall. A minor cruelty. Something he had done to a neighbor's cat with a stick. The specific shame of it. The way he had looked around to see if anyone had seen. 1 minute. Precise. Then the watch's movement completed its forward tick, and he was in the workshop. Hands on the bench, heart going with the particular unsteadiness of someone who has just been somewhere real without moving. He sat for a long time. He made notes. He was a craftsman, and the craftsman's response to the inexplicable was documentation. He wound it again the following morning. A different memory. Also his. Also sealed. Something he had done at 14 that he had buried with the thoroughness of adolescent shame, and which arrived now in full sensory resolution. 1 minute. Exact. The shame was fresher this time, the memory more recent in his history, the event less easily categorized as a child's unformed cruelty and more easily recognized as a choice he had made knowing it was wrong. He wound it 8 times over the following 3 days. Each memory was his own. Each was darker than the last, not by enormous increments, but consistently. A graduated revelation of a self he had, apparently, been carefully not examining for 62 years. Things he had done in his 20s. A deception. A betrayal he had rationalized so thoroughly that he had genuinely believed, until the watch returned it, that he had forgotten it naturally. He was 62 years old, and he was discovering a more extensive moral inventory than he had given himself credit for. The 9th wind produced something different. The memory that arrived was his own. He was certain of this, had the same quality of recognition and bodily ownership as every previous one. But it was from last week. A moment, 4 days ago, in a conversation with his daughter that he remembered clearly, and which the watch showed him at a slightly different angle, with the specific highlighting of a detail he had missed in real time. The expression on her face when he had interrupted her, the particular quality of dismissal in his own voice that he had not, apparently, heard as dismissal when he was producing it. He had remembered the conversation as an ordinary exchange. The watch showed him what it had actually been. He set the watch down. He made extensive notes. He did not wind it for 2 days. The 10th wind, a memory from 3 months ago. The 11th, 6 months. He was moving backward through his recent life with each wind, and the memories were not the sealed, forgotten ones of the first 8 sessions. They were accessible memories, known memories, returned to him with a resolution and an angle that revealed what he had, systematically and without full awareness, edited out of his own account of himself. He had believed himself to be a careful, honest person. He was discovering, 1 minute at a time, that he was a careful and honest person with a very sophisticated editing apparatus. The 15th wind was from yesterday, the 16th from this morning. Edmund Drax sat in his workshop on a Wednesday evening and looked at the pocket watch resting on the leather pad of his workbench, and understood, with the particular clarity of a craftsman who has spent 40 years reading mechanisms, what the progression meant. The seal on the watch, the petition to keep time from escaping, to bind what was given to bind, was not a historical artifact or a period affectation. It was functional documentation of a working mechanism. Each counterclockwise wind opened the seal one increment further. The early winds had accessed sealed memory, the genuinely buried material. As the seal opened further, the accessible past had become available, then the recent past, then the present. The logical continuation of the sequence was the future. He wound the watch a 17th time on Thursday morning. The minute that arrived was not memory. It was forward. He was in his workshop, this bench, this afternoon light, and he was doing something he watched with the removed attention of an observer, rather than the immersed attention of a participant. He watched himself pick up a tool. He watched himself apply it to a piece he had on the bench. He watched the outcome. 1 minute exact. At 2:17 p.m. on Thursday, the events of the 17th wind sequence occurred exactly as he had seen them. He stood in his workshop and felt the specific cold recognition of a person who has just watched themselves perform an action they had no prior intention of performing, and had performed anyway, exactly as shown, as though the prior viewing had been not a prediction, but a script. He wound the watch an 18th time. The future it showed him was from a week ahead. He was in conversation with someone he recognized. He said things he had not intended to say. He made a decision he had not made. 1 minute of a future that was not a set of possibilities, but a single, fixed sequence, presented not with the quality of prophecy, but with the quality of record, as though it had already happened and was simply being retrieved. He sat with the 18th wind's content for 4 days. He tried, deliberately, and with the full engagement of a man who has been a craftsman for 40 years and knows the value of careful intention, to deviate from the sequence. He canceled the appointment. The person showed up anyway. He said different words. He heard his own mouth say the scripted ones. He made the other decision. He watched his hands make the shown one. On Monday evening, he wound the watch a 19th time. The mechanism that the pocket watch had been built to contain. The entity the engraved text called only what the mechanism was given to bind is a demon of predestination in the formal classification used by the specific Dominican tradition that had, in 1722, contracted its construction. It feeds on free will, not on souls, not on life force, not on any of the broader categories, specifically, exclusively on the capacity to choose. Each counterclockwise wind transfers a measured quantity of free will to the entity as payment for the accuracy of the accessed content. The seal, once broken to the degree the 19th wind achieved, was no longer a containment structure. It was a harvest completion record. The 19th wind showed Edmund Drax the rest of his life. Not a minute, the rest of it. Every day in compressed but complete sequence from Monday evening to whatever moment constituted his end. He watched himself move through decades of continued, skilled, apparently contented watchmaking. He watched himself say the correct things to his daughter, attend the correct appointments, make the correct choices. He watched himself from a distance that was, by the time the sequence reached the later years, not quite the removed attention of an observer, but something closer to the attention of a prisoner watching through glass. He was in the glass. He understood this during the 19th wind's content, with the clarity of a man who has spent 40 years reading mechanisms and can recognize by its behavior what a mechanism has been designed to do. He was in the gears. The winding mechanism had, across 19 sessions, drawn his free will through the crown and into the movement, and distributed it to the entity the watch had been built to bind, which had been feeding incrementally and had now, at the 19th wind, completed the harvest. The body at the workbench set the watch down. It picked up a tool. It returned to work. Its hands were steady. Its movements were precise. It hummed, faintly, a fragment of the Latin engraving. The response, not the petition. What speaks will cost. What costs will continue. Somewhere in the mechanism, in the space between the mainspring and the escapement, in the particular quality of a movement running at perfect, unvarying, self-winding regularity, Edmund Drax was present, watching, intact, unable to do anything at all except observe with the perpetual, unblinking attention of someone who has just understood what the rest of his life is going to look like, and who has no choice anymore but to watch it happen. The body at the bench worked in contented silence. The watch kept perfect time. He documented everything. That is the first thing I keep returning to. He wound the watch the first time as a mechanism test and made notes. He wound it the second time with a scientist's curiosity and made more notes. He understood the progression, early winds accessing sealed memory, later winds accessing the recent past, the sequence pointing clearly toward the future, and he wound it again. He wound it 19 times. I want to be fair about this. The decision to wind it the 17th time, the 18th time, was made by a man who was already mid-harvest. By the 16th wind, he had been transferring free will for 2 weeks in measurable increments. The Edmund Drax, who wound the watch on Monday evening, was not making the choice with the same freedom as the Edmund Drax who wound it the first time. That first wind, simple mechanism test, entirely reasonable, is the one that opened the seal. Everything after was the seal opening further. But there were moments, the pause before the 10th wind, 2 days without winding, documented in his notes as taking stock. The 4 days after the 18th wind, trying to deviate from the shown sequence. He knew what the progression was showing him, and he had enough to reason with, and he wound it again. The Latin was on the case. He translated it on the first day. What speaks will cost. He copied it into his notebook and found it interesting and moved on. What lives in Edmund Drax's workshop now is a skilled, contented, precisely functional watchmaker who will continue, for the remaining decades of a healthy life, to do excellent work. His clients will be satisfied. His daughter will find him oddly consistent. His movements will be steady and his humming will be faint and continuous. The watch keeps perfect time. He is inside it, watching. Thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Ilara, and I am your whisperer. I'll be here, waiting for you next time. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more. This has been Karma Quietly Whispers. See you soon.